'86 Ferrari Testarossa, looking at the underside. So we'll start at the front and work our way back. You can see a bunch of things right here. You can see that X up there in the trunk. That's part of the structural frame. That's all steel, and that's like the crash, kind of the crash zone, the crumple zone. You can see the steel components that the control arms for the suspension connect to, but then a lot of the actual body panels are aluminum. And over here on the left hand side you can see that there's some grating, some openings. This car has the AC condenser in the left front bumper, so you can see a fan in there and the air outlets. And you can also see a black round plastic duct. That's just an air duct, and that's going from the front bumper, and it's to help deliver air to the brakes, to cool the brakes. And the other side has one just like that as well. And then behind it here, behind the that front trunk area, you see the steering rack. It's not power, it's a manual steering rack. The steering rack is kind of the more silvery part up there. And then right below it is a black bar, which is the front sway bar. The suspension is pretty well thought out on the Testarossa here too, but you'd kind of expect that. It's a nicely fabricated steel lower control arm with the sway bar drop link mount here in the middle. The sway bar drop link mount is actually cast aluminum, where the control arm itself is steel, and then your shock absorber is mounted pretty much as far outboard as possible to the control arm, which is good. That makes the shock relatively straight up and down, not perfectly of course, but as close to it as possible. And then there is an upper control arm, so it's really a double wishbone suspension. And you see a ball joint up there at the top, and then a ball joint at the bottom. And your steering tie rod is on this side, so you can see that there. I'll let the camera focus. So that's how it pivots the wheel around, and you can see those ball joints again here. But it's pretty nice geometry. And then your sway bar is tucked right under the tie rod from the rack there. It's pretty nice geometry. The carrier, or the steering knuckle, the part that has the wheel bearing that the hub goes onto, is cast steel, and there's a different design for left and right. You can see where the caliper bolts to it in the back. And speaking of the calipers, let's see how much we can see through the wheel here, because this is kind of interesting. There are two bleeder caps on the caliper, a lower one and an upper one, so for the different pistons. I'm not entirely sure that the camera is catching this. So there's the upper bleeder up at the top, and the lower one is kind of right there above that lower piston. Moving backwards along the car, you can see the main floor, the underpan here. So that's all aluminum, and you can see a lot of rivets. So that's all just riveted to the steel structure of the car. And so this goes all the way to the back here, and then there's a secondary panel, also aluminum, which is actually over the gas tanks. And there's a hole in a drain plug, so if you ever had to drain the gas tank, that's where you would do that from without removing the panel, or you could remove the panel and easily access it. Now we get to the heart and soul of the Testarossa, which is its 12-cylinder engine, and its transmission and rear suspension. And it's actually all put together on a subframe, and my understanding is it all comes out as one unit. You can see the bolt joints there at the front, and then there's actually angled ones right at the lift arms there on the side. So you undo those bolts, those connections. You've got some connections to the rear of the frame, way up high, and the whole shock absorber assembly and the control arms and the engine, the transmission and the exhaust all comes out as one unit. So it seems like a pretty easy way to do it, because of course most of the work you're going to do on this engine, it's an engine out service is required. Oil filter in the front, nice finned pans on the bottom. This car has a little bit of an oil leak. You can see some oil dripping down from the front. A few other neat things I want to point out is you can see kind of a reddish duct. So it's taking some of the air from the side vents and it's actually ducting it back through that black plastic scoop again to the rear brakes. So they're making a real effort to cool the front brakes and the rear brakes. Here's that scoop on the other side. And then the rear suspension is a very similar layout with the control arms. It's got a lower control arm here, which is all steel, and then it has an upper control arm. Let's see if I can get a good shot to look at it with the X up there. So again, it's acting as a double wishbone, and they're using two shocks and two sets of springs in the rear. Most of the weight in this car seems to be in the rear with the engine back here, so that's probably why they've done that. You've got your CV joint with your axle there. You've got a little sway bar drop link going to a sway bar, actually pretty long arms there, sway bar that's right, that metal bar right above the catalytic converters. One interesting thing that I was noticing is that the wheel carrier, so that's going to be the part that holds the wheel bearing in the hub, is cast aluminum in the rear, and they're actually the same. There's the parts are the same part for left and right. You can see that the brake caliper is bolted on this one to the rear, but you can see mounting holes. Those two empty holes in the front are, you know, if that part was mounted on the other side of the car, this side of the car, the brake caliper mounts to the rear, and you can see those, you know, those mounting holes in the front, you know, that aren't used. So they're using the same part left and right, and that's pretty cool to see. Another thing people might find interesting is, I don't know how visible it is, but this wheel weight has these long scratch marks on the inboard side, and that's because the way that the weight was positioned, it actually, let's see if I can get the light on it, it actually rubs against the bolt, this lower control arm bolt. You can see it's pretty tight tolerance there, and it actually rubbed and machined the lead away to give it clearance, to give it room. Which makes you wonder, you know, whoever got the wheels balanced would have left the shop with this kind of scrape, 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 scrape noise, maybe a whomp, 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 and they must not have noticed it, and then, you know, I don't know, 15 miles later it went away, and they just said, well, maybe it was my imagination. Some other neat stuff to point out is you've got your shift linkage here. It's this black bar that's coming through the chassis. It goes to a coupler and then a little rubber boot as it goes into the transmission. So really the transmission is laying underneath the engine, is just kind of alongside the engine's oil pan there. And then another thing I noticed is on these headers, so it has three, or you know, it's got the headers are 3 cylinders going into one, going into each cat and then merging. And there's test ports for each cylinder. So there's 3 test ports, 1 on each pipe on this one, and then 3, 1 on each pipe. I don't know if you can see that third one for this one too, and it's the same on the other side of the engine. So I guess you can do a gas analysis on each cylinder individually if you're trying to tune it, or if you're trying to track down some kind of running issue. You can kind of see those headers going up to the heads there. You can see the bottom of the red head on this side, the Testarossa. You've got up here, there's kind of a red electrical plug. That's your main battery cable disconnect plug for when you separate the rear, you know, subframe here, the rear part of the frame with the engine to take it out. This side is the radiator with the fans. You can see the radiator fans up there. And on this side, you've got the radiator with the radiator fan, and then you've got an extra little oil cooler off to the side with its fans up high there. I can see for aligning it, there are shims between the suspension mount and the frame rail here. So depending on those shims, you can set the camber of the car. The more shims you use, the more it pushes out the lower control arm, the more of a negative inward angle it will give the rear wheels. And this side has shims as well. And then you get to the very back of the car. You've got your exhaust tips and this rear valance, more of the louvered grille there. And it's pretty unique to see such a large painted valance under the back of a car. You know, when this car sits on the ground, that valance goes way under it.